Hello and welcome to the second part of the tutorial for developing SOLIDWORKS add-ins from scratch. In this part we will be learning how to add a custom property manager page to our add-in to handle user inputs. We will learn how to create and show custom property manager page, how to bind the values of the controls to the custom data model, as well as how to assign the custom attribution such as icons and tooltip to your controls. We will also learn how to apply the validation rules to the inputs in the property manager page. We will start by adding new NuGet package to our project. I will navigate to Manage NuGet Packages and browse swex.pmpage package. I can simply click Install button, and this is going to be installed to our project. Now we will need to define the data model for our property manager page. I would like to explain this in a bit more details. If you've been using SOLIDWORKS property manager pages before, your approach would be to define the property manager page class, add controls, and then react on property manager page events to update your data model or your variables. Swex framework takes a slightly different approach. Let us discuss why do we need property manager pages. That's a way for our users to provide an input to our add-in. Furthermore, we would prefer to use property manager pages instead of the user control or pop-up form because it provides a native look and feel of our user interface. That means that you might not want to use a fancy alignments or fancy colors when building your property page. Rather, you want to make it look similar to another property manager pages in SOLIDWORKS. And this is a base concept of Swex framework. So you define your data model and framework will build property manager page for you. Of course, you're also able to provide customization for these controls. So let me start and show you how to do that. I'm going to add new class to my project. I'll give it a name, something like cylinder data. And to create cylinder, I need two inputs. One is a diameter and another one is a height. So I'm just going to add two corresponding properties to my data model. Now I need to bind that data model to my property manager page. For that, I'm going to declare the variable in my class of type property manager page X. I'm just going to import namespace. And that class requires two generic parameters. One is a handler and another is data model. So first, let me create a handler for my property manager page. You can just define one handler in your project and reuse it across different property manager pages. So let me create one. I'm just going to call it property page handler. That should be a public class. It should inherit property manager page handler from Swex framework library. And it also needs to be convisible. So I'm going to add convisible attribute and set its constructor parameter to true to mark the class as convisible. Now I can come back to my add-in and simply pass the type into the arguments. And my second argument, which corresponds to my model, is cylinder data. Finally, I'll create an instance of that variable within my onConnect function. The constructor requires you to pass the pointer to SOLIDWORKS application, which I can retrieve from the app property of Swex Add-In class. And I can also subscribe to some events. So if I go to handler property and I can find the closed event, so let me just handle that event. To display a property manager page, I need to call a show method of property manager page X class. And I can do that from within the on button click function. So let me just scroll down and I'll just suppress the line which creates cylinder, and instead I'm just going to display the property manager page. The parameter of show method expects you to pass the data model, which is going to be bound to that property manager page. So for that, let me create a new instance of data model. So I'm just going to declare that within the class variable. And finally, I'm just going to create an instance of that and just pass some default parameters. Default value of diameter would be equal to 10 mm and height would be equal to 20 mm. Now I'll pass the instance of the data model into the show method of property manager page X. Please note that framework will bind this property in two directions. So our property manager page will have the values assigned by default and also will override the values when user changes controls in property manager page. Let me now start SOLIDWORKS and see how it works. I'm going to create new part document and click on Create Cylinder button. So as a result, property manager page is displayed. Let's have a closer look at this property page. So firstly, we can see that the title equals to cylinder data, which is the name of the class we created for our data model. There are two number box controls, and those correspond to properties of our data model. Furthermore, you can see that framework identified the type of the properties is double and selected the number box control instead of text box to render those properties. So if I would have string property or if I would have enum property, it will create a text box and combo box correspondingly. Values of number boxes are pre-filled, and those are equal to the values we assigned to the properties when created an instance of our data model class. Let's now modify the values and click a green tick. So I can either type the value or I can just use a numeric up-down button to modify the value. When I click a green tick, my on-page closed event is raised, and you can see that the reason of the closing is the click of OK button. And you can see that the value of our instantiated variable for data class have been changed. That's the minimum you need to define the property manager page. So let's come back to our code and continue. Now I want to change a logic of my application slightly. Rather than asking the user to select the planar face or the plane, I would like to have a selection box in my property manager page where user could select the entity. For that, let's add another property to our data model and call it reference of type object. To let Swex framework know that this is a selection box, I need to decorate that property with corresponding selection box attribute. I should also pass the type of the selection I want to see in my selection box by specifying the parameters. So I want that to be datum plane or a face. I can leave this property as a type of object in case my entities do not share any common interface, or I can specify the specific interface. In my case, both iFace2 and plane, which is iFeature, will share the same iEntity interface. So I'm just going to set that as a type of my property. Let's now compile a project and give it a bit of a test. As usual, I would start by creating a new SOLIDWORKS part and clicking the create cylinder command. Now you can see there is a selection box in my property manager page. Let me click green tick. So you can see as I haven't selected anything, my reference is still null. Now let me come back to SOLIDWORKS and select reference. Let me just select front plane, click green tick. And you can see my reference variable is currently assigned to the com object, which will be equal to the front plane in SOLIDWORKS. Now I want to modify my code and actually create a cylinder with the parameters which user specified in our property manager page. So I'm just going to copy the code I had before in my button click event, and I'll paste it into the property manager page closed event. Before that, I'm going to check that property manager page is actually closed by clicking OK, as I don't want to create cylinder when user cancels the property manager page. I'm going to pass the parameters to the create cylinder method from my data model. So first parameter is the diameter, second parameter is the height. I want to slightly modify the creation of the cylinder. So previously it was expected that reference plane or face is selected. Now I want to change it, and instead I'm going to pass the entity to the method, and this method is going to be responsible for selecting the face, for creating the sketch and extruding that sketch. So I'm just going to add a new parameter iEntity and call it reference, and I'm going to pass that parameter to my create extrude method. And now I need to select that entity before proceeding with the code. If you remember, I need to select that entity with the mark 0, so I can use select for method, but I will need to compose a select data object, or I can simply use select by mark and just specify the parameters, so false for append and mark 0. I want to check the result of the selection, and if object failed to select, I'm just going to throw an exception. I need to map my reference property from the data model and pass it to this method. I also want to change the logic of our precondition handler. So currently our button is disabled if my plane or planar face is not selected. Because we no longer require the pre-selection of the object, rather we select that in the property manager page, I need to move that logic into the page itself. So for now I just want to comment out that code and remove the enable delegate from my add command group method, and later I will show you how to do that from the property manager page. Now as you can see, both of my buttons enabled by default because I have removed that validation for the selected entity. So let me create cylinder, select from plane, and then click green tick. My cylinder is created. So let me just come back and create it one more time, and I'm just going to select the invalid entity, so for example cylindrical face, and you can see now when I'm creating that cylinder I have an exception. So let me now just come back and modify that behavior. Rather than throwing the exception, I want to forbid the selection of invalid entity. At first I want to add the cancel button to my property manager page so user can cancel the operation. This could be done by specifying the options for property manager page via page options attribute. So here I can select that property manager page should contain cancel button and also an OK button. One of the overloads of selection box attribute allows to specify the filter for my selection box, or I could specify the custom logic of whether this entity is allowed to be selected or not. So let me add new class to my project, and I'm going to call it reference selection custom filter. We need to inherit that class from selection custom filter class from swex framework and specify the type of the entity we're going to handle. In our case this is iEntity. Now we can override the filter function and provide custom logic of whether our entity should be selected or not. This function is going to be called every time user attempts to select an entity into our selection box. The logic of this button is very similar to the one we used to have in our enable state button function of add-in. So I'm just going to copy code from here and slightly adjust it. So the only additional logic for our filter is in the case of the selected face, we need to make sure that face is planar. So I'm just going to cast the provided entity to iFace interface and just make sure that this one is plain, and if it is not, I'm going to return false, which basically means that we should forbid the selection of that entity for the user, otherwise I'm going to return true. Now I need to specify the type of custom selection filter as the first parameter of the selection box attribute. I also want to move my try catch block because currently it is in my button click event, but this is not where the cylinder is created, because now that function is executed from the closing of the property manager page. So let me just quickly move the try catch block from here into here. Another precondition for creating the cylinder is a selected base entity. So let's not allow our property manager page to be closed if our entity is not selected. For that I need to handle the closing event of property manager page, and in here I can check my conditions and I can optionally cancel the closing of property manager page and display the tooltip with a warning. So let me check if reason is okay. So if I close in the property manager page with green tick, I need to make sure that my reference is not null. And if it is null, I can simply use the arc parameter and set an error message to the error to be displayed to the user. So like in this case, select reference. And I should also say the cancel property to true, so our page won't be closed. Let's give it a try. I'm just going to put the breakpoint here. Let's create new part document. Start our property manager page, and now I'm just going to modify the parameters, but do not select the plane. So you can see our condition here is not met, and we're going to forbid closing of property manager page. So let me show it one more time. So you can see our error warning is displayed in a tooltip. But if I would select the entity, our condition is met and our property manager page is closed and cylinder is created. Now let's check how our custom filter works. I'm just going to put the breakpoint onto the filter function so we can debug it. So at first let's try to select the plane. So you can see that function is called and we're going to return true from that function, and the entity is selected in our selection box. Now let's select cylindrical face. You can see we can go into the function and the condition is not met, so our entity is not selected. If I would try to select origin, it is also not selected because it does not match filter. But if I select the planar face, our function returns true and we have it in our selection box, so we can create a cylinder. Now let's customize the look of our controls and the property manager page itself. In the swex frameworks you can use the same set of attributes to assign title, icon and description. So let me just copy a few attributes from my button from my add-in, and I'm just going to decorate my main class for property manager page. So let me just copy paste it over here. I'm not going to use description, so I'm just going to use title and the icon. And because we're going to use exactly the same title for our button and for our property manager page, it is a good idea to share that resource. So title attributes allows to specify the static text, but it also allows to look the value from the resources. So let me open the resources of that project and add new string value. I will call it command title create cylinder and fill the value. So now I can just use an overload of a title attribute and can just specify the resources I want to load my title from. So it will be very similar to the icon attribute. I'm just going to select the name of my resource. For consistency, I'm going to copy that attribute and put it back to my button. So if I would like to rename that button, it will be updated for both property manager page and my button title. In a very similar way, I can decorate the controls of my property manager page. So to add a tooltip, I need to use a description attribute and assign the value. So let me just specify my tooltip for all three controls. I can assign the common options for controls such as height or color using the control options attribute. I can just use named parameter and assign, for example, in this case, a height to be equal to 12. I can continue and assign the icons. There are two types of icons I can assign to property manager page controls. One are standard icons, and you can browse from the available list. So for this case, I have a predefined icon and I just can use a select face icon. And I can select in a similar way the icon for my diameter control because it is already available. Please follow this web page for the list of available icons and their previews. But unfortunately the list of available standard icons is limited, so you might not be able to find the icon for you. So in this case, there is no icon which corresponds to height. Fortunately, Swex framework provides an easy way to assign the custom icons to control. So in exactly similar way, you can either use the overload of control attribution and specify the resource and the name, or you can just use an icon attribute. So let me just copy that attribute, assign it here, and next I'm just going to add my custom icon to my resources. So I activate images, click add existing file, select the PNG icon, transparency is supported as well. And now just browse this resource name in my attribute value. We can now start our project and validate the results. Let's create new part. Open property manager page. So you can see the icon is assigned, the title is assigned as well. We have our green tick and red cross button. We also have icons for our controls, including the custom icon, and our tooltips are displayed when we hover the mouse above the controls. Each control on property manager page can have some specific option in addition to the common options. To assign the specific options for number box control, we need to use number box option attribute. And we can just browse the parameters of that attribute to assign the specific options. So for example, we can specify what is the type of the units which our control holds. So in our case, we're going to use a length. We can also assign the options such as what is our value for the fast, slow, increment, etc. We can just copy that attribute and assign the same one to the second number box control, which corresponds to height. Let's start SOLIDWORKS to see the changes. Now our number control look a bit different. We have a units, so we can just specify the value with units. We can also use the thumb wheel to change the value of our dimensions. Let me now come back to the code in Visual Studio and implement the property manager page for the box. I will firstly add a new resource for the title of my command. So that's going to be create box. I will change my attribute for my command button in Property Manager page Command Manager toolbar. I will replace it with an attribute to read the value from the resources. I will add a new class called box_data for the data model for my Property Manager page. I will be using similar attributes to assign the attribution for my Property Manager page, with the only difference that it's going to be using different title and different icon. We need to have the same reference property in our box data, so we can just copy it from there. We also have a slightly different data model for our inputs, so we'll need to have a double for width, for length, and for height. So let me just add 3 properties. And I'm actually going to copy the height from here because it's going to be exactly the same. And I can also copy the attribution from that height number box to width and length. I will change the icons for width and length controls by browsing the standard ones. And I can also modify the tooltips by changing the value of the description attribute. I can continue and I will declare the instances for my data model and Property Manager page. So I'll create an instance of box data. I'll just copy the definition of Property Manager page. I'll change the name of the variable and the data model. I will instantiate my data model and Property Manager page here. I can assign the default values. I replace the variable names. I need to change the name of my handler functions. I'll also change the data model. I need to make a copy of my handler functions and rename them. I will need to call the corresponding functions to create box instead of the cylinder and pass the parameters from my data model. Validation logic for precondition regarding the selected base reference is the same for cylinder and for the box. So to avoid code duplication, I can create a separate function which is doing that functionality. I'm just going to call it from both handlers of box and cylinder creation. Finally, I will do minor refactoring of the code and move validate reference function to the end of the class. And as the last step, I need to show my Property Manager page from which the button click of Create Box command. We can now start SOLIDWORKS and validate our complete functionality. We should be able to create both box and cylinder. Let's click the Create Cylinder button. Let's Create Box button. So you can see there is a different Property Manager page shown. We can select the face, we cannot select the cylindrical face. You can change the parameters. Click green tick to generate the box. This completes the second part of the tutorial for creating the add-ins. In the next and the last part of this tutorial, we will learn how to transform this add-in to create the configurable elements using macro feature to create the geometry for cylinder and box. Thank you for your time.